I didn't argue when my son told me I was no longer needed in the family company I had helped build for more than 30 years. I simply smiled, signed the papers they placed in front of me, and walked out of the building. What Daniel didn't realize that afternoon was that 2 years later, he would walk into a boardroom and find himself asking me for a job. The morning that changed everything began like any other Tuesday in Dallas, Texas. The sun was already warming the glass windows of Whitmore Construction's downtown office tower, the same building my late husband and I had once dreamed about while sitting at our small kitchen table decades earlier. Back then the company was nothing more than a pickup truck, a rented storage unit, and a stack of handwritten invoices. We worked long hours, sometimes 14 or 15 a day, building a reputation one contract at a time. Over the years that little operation grew into a respected regional firm handling commercial developments across North Texas. I had handled the books, negotiated contracts, and built relationships with clients who trusted our name. My husband handled the field operations. And when he passed away 12 years earlier, I kept the company steady while my son Daniel learned the business. By the time he turned 35, Daniel had stepped into the role of president. I was proud of him. At least, I thought I was. That Tuesday morning I arrived at the office a little before 8, the same time I had arrived nearly every workday for the last 3 decades. The receptionist, Carla, greeted me with the same warm smile she always had. She had been with us for 16 years, long enough to remember when Daniel was still a college student stopping by during summer breaks. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," she said as she handed me the morning mail. "Looks like a busy day." I nodded and thanked her, though something in the air felt slightly different. The hallway outside the conference room was already full of voices. Normally our executive meetings didn't begin until 9, but I could hear Daniel speaking inside, along with another voice that had become increasingly familiar over the past few years, his wife, Ashley. Ashley Whitmore had married my son 3 years earlier. She had an MBA from a respected university and a sharp confidence that impressed people quickly. At first I welcomed her ideas. Fresh perspectives can be healthy in any business. But over time, her suggestions became decisions. And those decisions gradually pushed me further from the center of the company I had helped build. When I stepped into the conference room that morning, several department managers were already seated around the long walnut table. Daniel stood near the projector screen reviewing slides, while Ashley sat beside him flipping through a stack of printed reports. Daniel looked up and gave me a polite smile. Not warm. Not cold. Just polite. "Mom, thanks for coming," he said. "We wanted to talk about the company's future." I took my usual seat at the far end of the table. The same seat I had occupied for years. The presentation began immediately. Charts appeared on the screen showing growth projections, market trends, restructuring plans. Ashley spoke confidently about modernization, new systems, new leadership structures. As she talked, I noticed something unusual. My name never appeared on a single slide. When the presentation ended, Daniel folded his hands on the table and looked directly at me. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Mom, you've done an incredible job guiding this company for a long time. But Ashley and I think it might be time for you to enjoy retirement. The industry is changing, and we need to move in a new direction." Around the table, several managers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. No one spoke. I looked at my son for a long moment. The boy I had once carried on my hip while reviewing blueprints in a dusty trailer office was now sitting across from me explaining why I was no longer necessary. I felt a strange stillness settle over me. Not anger. Not sadness. Just clarity. Ashley slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside were neatly prepared documents formalizing my retirement from Whitmore Construction. I opened the folder slowly, reading the first page. Then I picked up the pen resting on top of the papers. Daniel watched quietly, expecting an argument. But I didn't give him one. I signed the documents, closed the folder, and pushed it gently back across the table. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the door. As I reached the hallway, I heard the quiet murmur of voices beginning behind me. The meeting was already continuing without me. And as I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, one thought crossed my mind with surprising calm. They believed I had just walked away from everything. They had no idea that this was only the beginning. The elevator doors closed quietly behind me, and for the first time in more than 30 years I was leaving the building without knowing when I would return. The ride down from the 10th floor to the lobby took less than 30 seconds, but in that brief moment a lifetime of memories seemed to pass through my mind. I remembered the early mornings when my husband and I used to unlock the office together, the smell of fresh blueprints spread across a folding table, and the long days when we were not sure if the company would survive another month. Back then success was never guaranteed. Every contract mattered. Every client mattered. And every employee mattered. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped into the marble lobby and walked slowly past the reception desk without looking back. Outside, the Texas sunlight felt warmer than usual, almost unfamiliar. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment watching traffic move through downtown Dallas, wondering how many times I had rushed through these same streets thinking only about the next project deadline. For decades, the company had been the center of my life. Now it belonged to someone else. That afternoon I drove home through neighborhoods filled with construction sites that once carried our company logo on bright blue signs. Some of those projects were developments I had personally negotiated years earlier. I remembered shaking hands with developers, reviewing contracts late at night, and making sure every invoice balanced down to the last dollar. Those details mattered to me because the company had never just been a business. It had been our family's legacy. When I pulled into my driveway, the house felt unusually quiet. The same brick home where Daniel had grown up now seemed larger than I remembered. I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of iced tea before sitting at the small wooden table near the window. For a long time I simply looked out at the backyard where my husband used to grill on summer evenings while Daniel practiced throwing a baseball across the lawn. Those were simple days. Honest days. The kind of days when people built things slowly and respected the work it took to create them. My phone rang a little after 3 o'clock. The number on the screen belonged to Robert Keller. Robert had been one of our earliest clients nearly 25 years earlier when his development company built its first small office complex outside Fort Worth. Over time we completed 6 projects together. He was a careful businessman who believed in steady growth and loyal partnerships. I answered the call and heard his familiar voice immediately. He had already heard the news about my retirement. In the construction industry, information travels quickly, especially when a leadership change happens in a company that has been stable for decades. Robert did not ask many questions. Instead, he said something that caught my attention. He told me he had been thinking about launching a new infrastructure firm focused on long-term commercial development across North Texas. The region was growing rapidly, and he believed the market needed experienced leadership that understood both construction and finance. He said he trusted my judgment and wanted to know if I would consider advising the new company during its early stages. I looked out the window again as the afternoon sunlight stretched across the yard. For the first time since leaving the office that morning, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not regret. Something quieter. Something more deliberate. Robert continued speaking about potential projects, land acquisitions, and the importance of careful planning during expansion. His voice was calm and practical, the way experienced builders often speak when they are discussing something that will take years to complete. When he finally paused, I realized several minutes had passed. I set my glass down on the table and gave him my answer. I told him I would be happy to meet and discuss his idea further. Because while my son and his wife believed I had just stepped away from the world of business, what they did not understand yet was that experience does not disappear simply because someone signs a retirement document. And sometimes the most important decisions begin the moment everyone else believes the story is already finished. I met Robert Keller 3 days later at a quiet cafe just outside Fort Worth, a place overlooking a stretch of land that had once been empty pasture but was now slowly filling with new office parks and distribution centers. North Texas had always grown in waves, and anyone who paid attention could see the next one coming long before the cranes arrived. Robert was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, studying a set of printed site maps spread neatly across the surface. He stood to greet me with the same firm handshake I remembered from years earlier. Robert Keller had the kind of presence that made people listen carefully when he spoke. He was not loud or dramatic, but his confidence came from decades of watching good decisions turn into profitable buildings. We ordered coffee, and for the first few minutes we spoke about ordinary things. The weather. The steady growth across Dallas and Fort Worth. The way the region had changed since our first project together almost 25 years earlier. Eventually Robert turned one of the maps toward me and began explaining his idea. The plan was ambitious but thoughtful. He wanted to create a new infrastructure company focused on long-term commercial development, including industrial parks, logistics centers, and mixed-use office complexes. Instead of chasing quick contracts, he wanted a company that planned 10 or 15 years ahead. That approach immediately caught my attention. Most construction companies focus on the next job. Very few think about the next decade. Robert explained that he had investors interested in the concept, but he needed someone who understood both construction management and financial discipline. Someone who had actually built a company from the ground up. He said my name had come to mind immediately after hearing about my retirement. I studied the maps carefully while he spoke. The locations he had selected were smart. Several were positioned near major interstate corridors where distribution hubs were expanding quickly. One site alone covered more than 100 acres, large enough to support multiple industrial buildings over time. The numbers he outlined were conservative but promising. For the first time since leaving my office earlier that week, I felt the familiar rhythm of strategic thinking returning. I asked questions about financing structures, contractor partnerships, and municipal approvals. Robert answered each one calmly, clearly pleased that the conversation had shifted from theory to planning. At one point he leaned back in his chair and said something that stayed with me. He said the industry had plenty of young executives with impressive degrees, but very few people with the patience that comes from building something brick by brick over decades. Experience, he said, was the one resource that could not be rushed. When the meeting ended nearly 2 hours later, we had already outlined the foundation for a new company. It would begin small, with a focused leadership team and careful project selection. Growth would come through reputation rather than speed. As we walked outside into the bright afternoon sunlight, Robert asked one final question. He asked if I would be willing to take a larger role than simple advising. He said the investors would feel more confident if someone with my background helped lead the company directly. I paused beside my car for a moment before answering. The past few days had been full of unexpected changes, but standing there I realized something important. For years I had believed my chapter in business was slowly coming to a close. Now I understood that the story had simply taken a different direction. I told Robert that if we were going to build something new, then we should build it properly. Not as a temporary venture, but as a company designed to last for generations. Robert smiled slightly when he heard that. It was the same quiet smile I had seen years earlier when our first project together finished ahead of schedule. As I drove back toward Dallas that evening, the skyline appeared in the distance exactly as it had thousands of times before. The difference was that now I was looking at the city not as someone stepping away from the industry, but as someone preparing to enter it again in a way that very few people would expect. The following weeks moved with the quiet momentum that only serious work can create. Robert and I began meeting several mornings each week in a temporary office space he had leased near downtown Fort Worth. The room was simple, nothing more than a long conference table, 2 filing cabinets, and a whiteboard covered with project timelines, but to me it felt familiar in the best possible way. It reminded me of the early days when my husband and I used to plan every new contract with nothing more than determination and a stack of handwritten notes. Robert introduced me to the two investors who had agreed to support the company financially. Both were experienced developers who understood that construction success depends on patience as much as ambition. We spent hours discussing long-term strategy rather than quick profits. The goal was not to build the largest company in Texas overnight. The goal was to build the most reliable one. Our first official step was forming the company legally. Robert suggested the name Keller Infrastructure Group, a name that reflected both his development background and our focus on large-scale projects that supported the growth of the region. When the documents were finalized, Robert insisted that my role should be more than advisory. He said the company needed leadership that combined experience, financial discipline, and industry relationships. After several conversations with the investors, they agreed that I would serve as Chief Executive Officer during the company's early expansion. Hearing those words felt strange at first. Only a few weeks earlier I had been quietly leaving the office I had worked in for most of my adult life. Now I was stepping into a completely new role in a company that had not yet completed its first project. But uncertainty has never frightened people who understand construction. Every building begins as an empty piece of land. The real work begins when someone believes that land can become something useful. Over the next several months we assembled a small leadership team made up of people I trusted from previous projects. One of the first was Mark Alvarez, a project manager who had supervised 3 major developments for Whitmore Construction years earlier. Mark had a reputation for finishing projects on time and maintaining strong relationships with subcontractors. When I called him to explain the new venture, he listened carefully before asking a single question. He wanted to know whether the company would value careful planning over rushed deadlines. When I told him that patience was exactly what we intended to build our reputation on, he agreed to join us. Our next hire was Jennifer Collins, a financial controller who had previously worked with Robert's development firm. Jennifer had the kind of attention to detail that every construction company needs but few manage to keep for long. Within weeks she had organized our accounting systems, project budgets, and investment reporting in a way that allowed the entire team to see exactly where every dollar would be used. Slowly the framework of the company began to take shape. Meanwhile, construction activity across North Texas continued expanding. Distribution centers were appearing along major highways. Office parks were spreading into once quiet suburban corridors. Every crane in the skyline was a reminder that opportunities still existed for companies prepared to approach the market carefully. Our first project came sooner than expected. A logistics developer based in Houston was searching for a contractor to manage a new industrial complex outside Arlington. The development would cover nearly 60 acres and include several warehouse facilities designed for national shipping companies. The developer had previously worked with Robert and trusted his judgment. After several planning meetings, they agreed to award the management contract to Keller Infrastructure Group. When the signed agreement arrived at our office, I held the document in my hands for a long moment. It had been only a few months since I had left the company my husband and I once built. Now I was preparing to lead the construction of an entirely new project under a different name. The work ahead would not be easy. Starting a company always requires patience, discipline, and the willingness to prove yourself again from the beginning. But as I looked around the small office where our team was reviewing blueprints and construction schedules, one thing became very clear. This time we were not building something simply to survive. We were building something designed to outlast the expectations of everyone who believed my experience had already reached its final chapter. The Arlington project became the first real test of everything we had promised ourselves the company would stand for. Early one Monday morning our small team gathered around the conference table reviewing the construction schedule spread across several large blueprints. 60 acres of open land waited just west of the highway, a wide stretch of red Texas soil that would soon become a logistics center serving companies across the region. For many contractors, it would have been just another development, another contract to move through as quickly as possible. For us, it represented something much more important. It was the foundation of a reputation we had not yet earned. Mark Alvarez drove out to the site that same morning before sunrise. By the time the rest of us arrived an hour later, he had already walked the entire property line and spoken with the surveying crew. I stepped out of my car and felt the dry breeze moving across the open field while the first construction trucks rolled slowly through the temporary entrance road. The land was quiet except for the distant hum of highway traffic and the low voices of workers preparing equipment. Standing there reminded me of the earliest days of construction projects I had worked on decades earlier. Every major development begins with a moment like that. An empty piece of ground. A group of people studying plans. And a shared belief that something solid will soon rise where nothing stands yet. Over the next several weeks, the site transformed steadily. Excavators carved out the foundations while delivery trucks brought steel beams and concrete materials onto the property. Mark supervised every phase carefully, walking the site several times each day with the calm focus that had made him one of the most respected project managers I had ever worked with. Jennifer tracked every cost and payment schedule back at the office, ensuring that every invoice matched the budget we had promised our investors. Robert continued meeting with developers across the region, quietly building relationships that would support the company's long-term growth. Slowly our team found its rhythm. The Arlington project moved forward exactly the way a well-managed construction site should. There were no dramatic announcements, no flashy press releases. Just steady progress measured in steel frames rising against the sky and concrete floors poured with precision. By the end of the third month, the first warehouse structure stood nearly complete, its wide roof panels reflecting the bright Texas sunlight. Standing at the edge of the site one afternoon, I watched a group of workers guide a crane as it lifted the final beam into place. Moments like that have always been the most satisfying part of construction. Not because of the machinery or the scale of the building, but because of the quiet teamwork required to make it happen. Each person performs their role. Each decision supports the next step. And slowly a vision becomes a structure that did not exist before. Around that same time, Robert returned from a development conference in Houston with news that surprised even him. Several investors had begun hearing about the progress on our Arlington project. Word had spread that a new infrastructure firm in North Texas was delivering work with the kind of reliability many developers believed had disappeared from the industry. Within weeks, Robert scheduled meetings with 2 additional developers interested in future projects. The company that had started with one contract was already attracting attention across the region. One evening, as I reviewed project reports in my office, Jennifer knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. She placed a financial summary on my desk showing the updated projections for the Arlington development. The numbers confirmed what we had hoped from the beginning. The project was ahead of schedule and operating within budget. For a new company in its first year, that kind of performance mattered more than any advertising campaign ever could. After Jennifer left the office, I sat quietly for a moment looking at the skyline of Fort Worth visible through the window. Somewhere across the Metroplex, another construction company was also planning its next project, led by people who believed experience could be replaced with confidence alone. They believed the industry belonged entirely to the next generation now. What they did not understand yet was that foundations built over decades do not disappear simply because someone decides they are no longer necessary. And as cranes continued rising across North Texas, Keller Infrastructure Group was slowly becoming part of that skyline in ways very few people expected. By the time the Arlington Logistics Complex reached its final phase of construction, Keller Infrastructure Group was no longer just a promising startup. It had become a company that developers across North Texas were beginning to take seriously. The final inspections moved smoothly, and within weeks the first tenants began preparing their distribution operations inside the finished warehouse spaces. Watching trucks line up along the newly paved access roads brought a quiet satisfaction that is difficult to describe unless you have spent decades in construction. Buildings are not just structures of steel and concrete. They are proof that careful planning, patience, and teamwork still matter in an industry that often rushes forward without thinking about tomorrow. Our success with the Arlington project brought something else as well. Attention. Developers talk to one another constantly, and news about reliable contractors spreads quickly through the business community. Within a few months, Robert had scheduled meetings with several new clients interested in large-scale developments. One proposal involved a 200-acre industrial park planned along Interstate 30. Another developer wanted a long-term partner for a series of mixed-use office complexes expanding toward the northern suburbs of Dallas. Each opportunity required careful evaluation, but what mattered most was the reputation that had quietly begun forming around our company. Keller Infrastructure Group had delivered exactly what it promised. Meanwhile, the construction industry across North Texas continued evolving rapidly. New companies appeared every year, many led by younger executives eager to prove themselves in a competitive market. Some succeeded quickly. Others struggled under the pressure of aggressive expansion and risky contracts. That pattern had existed for decades, and I had learned long ago that experience often reveals which companies will last and which ones will fade away. One afternoon several months after the Arlington project opened, Robert walked into my office carrying a folder of industry reports he had received from a developer in Houston. He placed the documents on my desk and pointed to a section highlighting regional construction firms competing for upcoming contracts. I recognized several company names immediately. One of them was Whitmore Construction. I had not followed the company closely since leaving, but the reports provided a clear picture of its current situation. According to the financial summaries, Whitmore Construction had expanded aggressively during the previous year. Several large projects had been accepted within a short period of time, stretching the company's management team and financial resources. Rapid growth can look impressive from the outside, but in construction it often brings hidden risks. Budgets tighten. Schedules overlap. Small delays begin creating larger complications. Robert noticed my expression as I studied the report. He did not say much at first. Finally, he mentioned that a developer he spoke with recently had raised concerns about project coordination on one of Whitmore Construction's newer developments. Nothing catastrophic had happened. The project was simply experiencing delays that were beginning to affect surrounding schedules. That kind of situation is more common than most people realize. Construction depends on precise timing between contractors, suppliers, and financial planning. When one piece moves too quickly, the entire structure becomes unstable. I closed the report and set it back on the desk. There was no satisfaction in seeing another company struggle, especially one that carried the family name my husband and I had once worked so hard to build. But business decisions have consequences that unfold slowly over time. Every contract signed, every schedule approved, and every financial risk accepted eventually reveals its results. As the months continued passing, Keller Infrastructure Group moved steadily forward with new projects and partnerships. Our team expanded carefully, hiring only the people we believed would strengthen the company's long-term foundation. Across the region, cranes continued rising against the Texas sky, marking the growth of cities that had once been open farmland. And somewhere within that same expanding skyline, another construction firm was learning that confidence alone cannot replace the quiet discipline required to build something meant to last. The following spring brought a project that would quietly change everything. Robert called me into the conference room early one Monday morning while the rest of the team was still arriving. Spread across the table were documents from the Dallas Regional Development Authority outlining a major infrastructure expansion planned along the eastern corridor of the city. The proposal involved a multi-phase industrial complex designed to support several national logistics companies relocating operations to North Texas. The scale of the development was significant, covering more than 300 acres and requiring multiple contractors working in coordination for several years. For a construction company, projects of that size do not appear often. When they do, every serious firm in the region pays attention. Robert explained that the authority would award the primary management contract to one lead infrastructure firm responsible for coordinating the entire development. Subcontractors would then support individual sections of the project. Winning that contract would position the lead company at the center of one of the largest developments currently planned in the region. I studied the proposal carefully while he spoke. The timelines were demanding but realistic. The financial backing for the project appeared solid, supported by several investment groups and municipal incentives designed to accelerate economic growth in the area. It was exactly the kind of long-term development Keller Infrastructure Group had been preparing for since the day we opened our temporary office. Our team spent the next several weeks preparing the proposal with careful attention to every detail. Mark reviewed site management plans and contractor coordination strategies. Jennifer assembled financial projections demonstrating that our company had both the discipline and the stability required for a project of that magnitude. Robert met with developers and investors to reinforce the reputation we had quietly built over the previous year. The process required patience. Major contracts are never awarded quickly, especially when several established construction firms are competing for the same opportunity. One afternoon, as I reviewed updated proposal drafts in my office, Jennifer entered carrying a new industry report she had received that morning. She placed it on the desk and pointed to a section listing the companies that had officially submitted bids for the Dallas Regional Development Project. Keller Infrastructure Group was on the list. So were several other firms with decades of experience. And near the bottom of the page was another name I recognized immediately. Whitmore Construction. I read the list again slowly. There was nothing surprising about their presence. The project was exactly the kind of development any ambitious construction firm would pursue. Still, seeing the name printed there created a moment of quiet reflection. The company that once carried our family's legacy was now competing against the company I was helping to lead. I set the report aside and looked out the window toward the skyline of Fort Worth. In construction, competition is not personal. It is simply part of the industry. Companies prepare their proposals. Developers evaluate experience, financial stability, and project management capability. Eventually, one firm receives the call that determines the future direction of the development. Weeks passed before the selection committee scheduled the final evaluation meeting. By that time, our team had reviewed every page of our proposal dozens of times. The morning of the meeting, Robert and I drove together to the Development Authority's office building in Dallas. The conference room where presentations would take place overlooked a wide stretch of highway where traffic moved steadily toward the growing suburbs beyond the city. Several representatives from different construction firms were already present, quietly reviewing notes while waiting for the committee to begin. I noticed one familiar figure across the room speaking with another contractor near the windows. Daniel Whitmore stood there studying a folder of documents, dressed in the same confident posture I remembered from his early days leading the company. For a moment he did not see me standing beside Robert near the entrance. The years since I left the company had passed quickly, but standing in that room it felt as though the distance between past and present had narrowed in an unexpected way. The meeting had not yet begun, but the quiet tension in the room made one thing very clear. Soon one company would leave that building responsible for guiding one of the largest developments in North Texas. And whichever firm received that contract would shape the future of the project for years to come. The evaluation meeting began with the quiet formality typical of major development contracts. Representatives from the Dallas Regional Development Authority sat along the far side of the conference table reviewing thick folders filled with proposals from each competing firm. Large projects require careful decisions because every choice affects investors, city planning, and thousands of future jobs connected to the development. Robert and I took our seats as the presentations began one by one. Each company explained their experience, their management approach, and their strategy for coordinating a project that would unfold over several years. Some presentations were impressive in scale. Others relied heavily on aggressive timelines that promised rapid progress. When it was our turn, Robert spoke first, outlining the long-term infrastructure philosophy that Keller Infrastructure Group had built since its founding. He explained that our company focused on stability, careful financial planning, and disciplined project management rather than chasing rapid expansion. Then he turned the presentation over to me. I walked through our operational strategy step by step, explaining how coordinated scheduling between contractors, suppliers, and development planners would keep the project moving without the delays that often affect large construction efforts. The committee members asked thoughtful questions about risk management, workforce planning, and long-term maintenance planning. After nearly an hour, the presentation ended and the committee thanked us before moving on to the next company. When Whitmore Construction presented later that afternoon, I listened quietly from the audience seating area. Daniel spoke confidently, describing the company's growth and its ambition to manage larger developments across the region. His presentation emphasized expansion and speed, highlighting several projects the company had accepted within the previous year. From a distance, his confidence was clear, but experience has a way of revealing details that others might miss. Managing one large development requires focus. Managing several at once demands an organization that is prepared for the pressure that follows. When the final presentation concluded, the committee announced that the selection decision would be delivered within 2 weeks after reviewing all proposals carefully. The room slowly emptied as representatives from different companies gathered their materials and prepared to leave. As Robert and I organized our documents, Daniel finally noticed us standing near the exit. For a brief moment he seemed surprised, as though he had not expected to see me in that room. Our eyes met across the distance of the hallway. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet realization that circumstances had changed since the day I walked out of the Whitmore construction office. Neither of us spoke. In business meetings, words are often less important than the understanding that passes silently between two people who recognize the weight of the moment. Robert and I left the building and drove back toward Fort Worth through the steady afternoon traffic moving along Interstate 30. The city skyline stretched across the horizon exactly as it had for decades, cranes rising in several directions as new developments continued shaping the region. The next 2 weeks passed slowly. Major contract decisions rarely move quickly because every detail must be verified before the final announcement is made. Our team continued working on existing projects while waiting for the call that would determine the future of the Dallas Regional Development Project. One morning just after 9 o'clock, Robert stepped into my office holding his phone with a thoughtful expression. He had just finished speaking with a member of the selection committee. The decision had been finalized. Keller Infrastructure Group had been awarded the primary infrastructure management contract for the 300-acre development. The room remained quiet for several seconds after he delivered the news. Winning a contract of that size meant that our company would coordinate multiple contractors and subcontractors over the next several years. It was the kind of opportunity that shapes the direction of a company for an entire decade. Later that afternoon, the official announcement was released across industry channels and development networks throughout North Texas. Construction firms that had submitted proposals began reviewing the details of the contract structure and the list of supporting subcontractors that would be selected during the next phase. As Jennifer compiled the information packets for companies interested in joining the project, one name appeared on the preliminary list of subcontractor applicants. Whitmore Construction had submitted documentation requesting consideration for several portions of the development. I studied the list quietly before setting the papers back on my desk. The next phase of the project would involve selecting the subcontractors responsible for building individual sections of the development. And soon the companies chosen for those roles would meet directly with the firm now responsible for managing the entire project. The subcontractor selection meetings began the following month in the same conference room where our leadership team now reviewed the early development schedules for the 300-acre project. Large infrastructure developments require dozens of companies working together in carefully coordinated phases. Every contractor must understand not only their own responsibilities but also how their work connects to the progress of the entire project. Mark Alvarez and Jennifer Collins sat beside me as we reviewed the list of applicants that had submitted qualifications for different sections of the construction plan. Steel contractors, grading companies, logistics builders, and structural teams had all submitted documentation hoping to become part of the development. Among those names was Whitmore Construction. When their application packet appeared on the table, the room remained quiet for a moment. It was simply another company seeking subcontractor work, but everyone in the room understood the history behind that name. Years earlier, the company had been the center of my professional life. Now it was one of many firms requesting the opportunity to contribute to a project managed by Keller Infrastructure Group. Mark reviewed the documentation first, carefully examining their recent project experience and staffing plans. His responsibility was to evaluate each applicant strictly on professional qualifications and performance history. That standard applied equally to every company on the list. When he finished his review, he nodded thoughtfully and placed the folder back on the table. According to the documentation, Whitmore Construction still had a capable field team and experienced site supervisors. The company had clearly pursued aggressive growth during the past year, but the core construction staff remained technically strong. Jennifer then reviewed the financial section of the packet. Budget stability and contractor reliability matter greatly in projects of this scale. After several minutes, she confirmed that the company still met the financial requirements necessary for subcontractor consideration. Once those evaluations were complete, the decision became straightforward. Whitmore Construction would be invited to the next round of coordination meetings along with several other contractors being considered for different sections of the development. 2 weeks later, the subcontractor orientation meeting took place at our project office near the construction corridor east of Dallas. Representatives from several companies arrived early, reviewing project diagrams displayed across the walls of the conference room. The atmosphere was professional but focused. Every contractor present understood that this development would shape construction activity across the region for years to come. I stood near the front of the room with Robert as the final attendees entered. When Daniel Whitmore stepped through the doorway carrying a folder of documents, he paused briefly when he saw me standing beside the project schedule board. The moment lasted only a second before he continued walking toward the table where subcontractor representatives were taking their seats. The meeting began with a detailed overview of the development timeline. Mark explained how each phase of construction would depend on coordination between multiple contractors working on different sections of the property. Jennifer outlined the reporting procedures and financial accountability standards required for every subcontractor involved in the project. Finally, Robert introduced the leadership structure responsible for managing the development from beginning to completion. When my name was mentioned as the chief executive officer responsible for overall project oversight, the room remained respectfully quiet. Most of the contractors present had already reviewed the official contract announcements released earlier that month. Still, hearing the organizational structure explained directly within the room seemed to clarify the reality of the situation. At the end of the presentation, contractors were invited to discuss specific sections of work they hoped to manage within the development. Daniel waited until several others had spoken before finally raising his hand to ask a question regarding one of the logistics warehouse sections planned for the northern part of the site. His voice was steady and professional, the same tone he had used in countless project meetings during the years we once worked together. I listened carefully as he described the resources his company could dedicate to that section of the project. When he finished, I thanked him for the information and explained the coordination requirements that would guide subcontractor assignments during the coming weeks. Business discussions are rarely dramatic. Most of the time they unfold through calm explanations and practical decisions. Yet as the meeting continued, one fact had become unmistakably clear to everyone in the room. The project that would shape the next chapter of development across that corridor was now being managed by Keller Infrastructure Group. And among the contractors preparing to build sections of that development was the company that once believed my experience had already reached its final chapter.